Well, last week we started a series called Just to Clarify. And the idea behind this short series is this. There are some things sometimes that we might believe and have believed for a long time, and we're under the impression that we're right, but may not be exactly right. And it would be helpful if those are vital areas of our faith to do a little bit of an inventory and go, okay, so what's the standard at which I compare this to know whether I'm online with this or not. So last week we looked at what is it that makes us a Christian? How do you become one? There's so many that would call ourselves Christian and might even be under the impression we are. But what does it really mean to be a Christian? And so if you want to catch up on that one, if you missed it, you can go to our website and you'll find it in our archives for last week, and you can check that out. So this week I want to talk about something that would be probably for those of us that would have said yes to last week. That's my experience. The born again deal is my deal. But what from there? Where do we go from there? And I want to look at an incident from Jesus' life, from an encounter he has with a guy that helps give us a little bit of an idea of what it really means to follow Jesus. See, that's another term that we use so often. And what does it really mean to follow Jesus? So let's dive right into the story. It's a story that is told to us in the first person, though it's written in the third person. It's written and told to us by a guy named Matthew, which he was a friend of Jesus. And if you're familiar with the New Testament, his is the first eyewitness account that we have in the New Testament under, incidentally, his name, Matthew. And so I want to pick up the story from Matthew's account in chapter 9. It's the first day that he meets Jesus, first encounter with him, it appears. And this is how it starts in verse 9 of Matthew 9. It says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. So a little bit of background here, first of all. Oftentimes the imagery that would go off in our minds when we think of tax collecting is the IRS, right? And rightfully so. We think possibly of a grouchy IRS auditor out to get you by combing through your tax returns and looking for something, anything, to wring out a few extra hard-earned dollars from you. We really don't like the IRS. If you work for them, sorry. Sorry. So here's maybe some of the things that we would think about. I had never noticed this before, but this woman just comes to realization that the IRS, when it's put together, is theirs. We kind of suspected that, right? But that's just to assure that. Then here's a dad who wants to give his son a good education and an intern experience. My son wants to pursue a career in blackmail and larceny. I was wondering if you folks here at the IRS have an internship program. And lastly, here's a new diagnostic tool that doctors are using these days apparently. We're trying to make our stress tests more realistic. IRS auditor shows up. And actually, this is probably more what you might think of in the first century, with Matthew sitting at a table in a public square in the marketplace, collecting taxes from income, from things that are sold, for property, for just about everything. The Hebrew people were incredibly taxed into poverty and submission in many cases. And so as much as you might dislike the IRS, the first century Jewish people had even more reason to dislike guys like Matthew and their equivalent of that. You see, the Roman tax law was actually more of a free enterprise system than our tax system is. Here's how it worked. You would have wealthy people back in the city of Rome who would bid to Caesar for the right to collect taxes in regions of the kingdom. And it went to the highest bidder, which really was pretty brilliant on Caesar's part because he got all his tax money up front. And then it was up to whoever bought the right to collect taxes to gather as much as he could to return his investment. But oftentimes it was more than that. But the way he would do it is he would sell his right to collect taxes to local and regional tax collectors. And Matthew is one of these guys. Now, why would he do it? It's actually a brilliant strategy because people didn't submit their tax return. You actually had to know what people were doing. You had to be around when they were trading. You needed to know where they lived. You needed to know who could pay the most. And who would know that better than local people right on the ground, people in the community? And that was just a great way to collect taxes. Well, you can guess. As Matthew and others like him would experience, he's collecting taxes, exorbitant taxes, from his friends, probably not his family unless he didn't like them, like he taxed the life out of his mother-in-law, right? But the rest, not so much, but he's collecting from neighbors and other people who know him, and they thought very badly of Matthew. They thought really badly of him. They thought he was treasonous. They had a notion that Matthew was a sinner, but he was worse than that. He was somebody that sinners would look down on because he was a tax collector. So, proper protocol that afternoon or morning as Jesus comes into the marketplace to see Matthew sitting there, proper protocol, because Jesus was a good religious guy, would be just to ignore Matthew, or better yet, cross the street and not even walk on the same sidewalk or side of the market that he was at. And if he did, to scowl at him as he went by. That would be acceptable. And so, as Jesus has this encounter with Matthew, everybody around kind of expects that response from Jesus to do that, because that was proper protocol. Only thing is, Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus heads over to the table where Matthew is, and by now, those around close must be thinking, well, he's got some taxes to pay. But that's not Jesus' motive at all. Matthew, on the other hand, is probably thinking, all right, some tax dollars. And then when he realizes Jesus isn't taking any money out to pay him, he goes, oh no, it's another one of these religious guys. This is the third one this week, who's here to shame me and ridicule me and demean me. That's what he's going to do. So go ahead, give it to me, Jesus. I keep hearing this all the time. I know you think I'm a traitor. Just let me have it. And those that are watching are going to go, this is going to be good. Like, he is going to go all Conor McGregor on him right here, right now. This is going to be fantastic. I mean, Jesus is going to let him have it. He's going to tell him that his life is headed no place. It's a dead-end world that he's in, and he's irredeemable. He's not only a traitor to his country, but he's a lost soul to God, because that would be the message that he needs to hear. Instead, Jesus does, as we know, if we know the story, the entirely unexpected thing. More than that, he does the shocking and ridiculous thing. Now, unfortunately, many of us are so familiar with the story, it loses its impact. It loses its emotional connection for us because we know what Jesus does already. Those that were gathered there did not know what he was going to do next. And when he does this, it absolutely floors them. This is what we know. He goes over to Matthew, and rather than demean him, he says, Matthew, follow me, and be my disciple. Well, wasn't that a nice gesture on Jesus' part? Jesus, you're always so nice. Once again, you're reaching out to somebody who nobody will reach to, probably encourage the living daylights out of him just to be asked or talked to, and rather than ridiculed. You're a really nice guy. Well, it was a lot more than that. It was a whole lot more than that. What Jesus was inviting Matthew to was not just to join his merry band of happy followers and difference makers, to travel around the country and heal people and do good and those kinds of things, not kind of a way to just redeem Matthew's reputation. There's something different going on here. You see, Jesus is a rabbi, and he's inviting Matthew into the best opportunity Matthew will ever get in his entire life. On one hand, it's a great opportunity. On the other hand, Jesus is inviting Matthew into the most radical change of lifestyle and worldview he's ever considered in his life. Here's the thing. Jesus is inviting Matthew to follow, actually follow him, to leave the tax collecting business, to go buy a tent, maybe a few camping supplies, and hit the road with Jesus. That's what following meant. We don't quite see it that same way, but that's what following meant. A bit of background to following a rabbi, specifically an ordained rabbi. To be called a rabbi in general just simply meant that it was somebody who was called a teacher, and there were lots of those. Almost every synagogue throughout Israel would have had a teacher, a rabbi in that sense. However, an ordained rabbi was something much different. The lifestyle of an ordained rabbi was far more nomadic. It didn't have one synagogue to be part of. Instead, it was sort of like an itinerant adjunct teacher traveling from synagogue to synagogue, teaching and applying the Hebrew scriptures. And you know something? I learned something this week as I studied this. There weren't very many rabbis, ordained rabbis, in the whole country. Historians would tell us that Jesus was one, likely he functioned like an ordained rabbi. In fact, as best those historians can tell you, in the entire first century, in all of Israel, for 100 years, there were only 35 recognized ordained rabbis in a 100-year span. It's really remarkable. There weren't very many of them. And Jesus was one of them, doing rabbiing like them. However, he wouldn't have been probably gotten his rabbi credentials the way the rest of the ordained rabbis did. Here's what typically happened. It was really hard to become a rabbi. It was almost as hard to become a follower of an ordained rabbi as well. The education and discipline needed to become a rabbi and a follower made it almost impossible to reach. The expected path to become a rabbi or a rabbi follower started when one was a little boy or a little girl, about 5 years old or so. And you would go to elementary school, something they called Bet Sefer. And there you would learn, believe it or not, I know this is a little surprising, was for me, is from between the ages of 5 and 10, you would memorize all of or large parts of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, is that remarkable? Okay, how many of you here have memorized the first 5 books of the Old Testament? The first book, the first chapter, the first word. In the beginning. There you go, I helped you out. Okay, good. This is really remarkable. And by the time you're 10 years old, after 5 years of this, if you're the best of the best in the class, and you've really caught on and you've done it and you've actually made it through the 5 years, you would graduate to Bet Talmud. That would be like elementary school. It would be like the next step, I guess you could say. If you didn't, and most of the kids didn't, they went home now. Their education, their formal education is over. They're now going home to work in the family business. They're going to be a tent maker alongside of their dad, maybe in a vineyard, or they're going to be a carpenter, as Jesus' experience would have been, probably not at this age, but he would have grown up with some trade in that as well. But if you moved on because you were the best of the best, now, get this, you would now memorize all of or a large part of the entire Old Testament. That's a lot. And you would work at that till you're about 15 years of age or so. If you survived that long, now there's just a small pool of these kids that are doing it. But if you really excelled and showed your ability to do this, to learn the Hebrew language and memorize the scripture and apply it, you would graduate to the next group, which was the Bet Midrash. Doesn't mean anything, except it was higher level education. You were now memorizing more and more and more. And you would, if you were at the top of your class, you would graduate from that. And the next step for you was to find a rabbi that would teach you. And if you were really fortunate, you would find a ordained rabbi. But there were so few of them, so very few of them. So it was an incredible thing to find a rabbi who would take you in, who would teach you and train you, and would grow with you. See, now you're not just learning information. Should you find a rabbi that will take you, you're actually going to live with him. You're going to eat what he ate. You're going to walk where he walks. You're going to meet who he meets. You're going to sleep where he sleeps. You're doing life with him because you're no longer trying to learn details from him. You're trying to actually become like him, to think like him, to speak like him, to do the things that he does. This is what that next step was. And there's no time stamp on this one. Oftentimes that would be 10 or more years. And if you excelled in that, and there were just obviously a few, maybe one every once in a while who would graduate from that. And now you would be taken to Jerusalem, to the temple, and a cadre of ordained rabbis would ordain you. And now you were an incredibly elite company. That is a picture of what is happening between Jesus and Matthew. Jesus is already functioning like that ordained rabbi, although there's no indication that he was formally ordained by anybody. He probably got those credentials from a higher power, if you get what I mean. And so when Jesus comes to Matthew, he is absolutely shocked, as is everybody else. Because Matthew didn't go looking for him, which was the normal pattern. The rabbi, the ordained rabbi, came looking for Matthew, the most unlikely, and Matthew can't believe his good fortune. Possibly, he too had been to Beth Sefer and had tried to catch on to the Torah, but he got expelled in the first week because of bad behavior. Maybe. Or maybe he never ever graduated, and maybe his family was already part of the despised tax collecting family, and he didn't even qualify to go to school. Or maybe his family was a family of atheists, and they just didn't share this ancestral faith. But clearly, he did not make it as a rabbi, that's for sure. In any event, what Jesus has offered him is a shot at redemption, respectability, and public credibility, and he is not going to pass it up. I find this interesting. If you read a little further in Matthew, if you go to, I think it's Matthew 13, Matthew writes something that Jesus wrote. When Jesus is describing life with him in his kingdom, Jesus says this. He says, it's like a farmer going out in the field and finding a treasure that no one else knows about. And he covers it up, sells everything he has to get that treasure. Or it's like a pearl merchant who has all these pearls but finds the pearl of a lifetime, sells everything else so he can have that one pearl. I wonder if Matthew was talking about himself, that he had experienced the treasure and the pearl. This is the nature of what Jesus asks, and so it's no wonder that his response to Jesus' invitation is this. So Matthew got up and followed him. Would have been a fool to not to, right? Matthew got up, sold his tax collecting business, got some camping equipment, signed up with Jesus, and walked with him. Who wouldn't? It would be a foolish thing not to sign up for that, wouldn't it? And Matthew can't wait to tell his family and friends. In verse 10, we read, later Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. That's all he knew. That's the only people he knew. So he invited them over because they too could have the treasure. But when the Pharisees, because they're always lurking, right? When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, Jesus' disciples, why does your teacher eat with such scum? Different perspective, right? Well, everyone knew exactly what Jesus was asking Matthew to be a part of when he invited him to become a follower of his. The religious people knew that. Those that were hanging with Jesus knew that, and certainly Matthew knew that. So this is what was happening. To become a follower, or an apprentice, if you will, a student, a disciple, is simply someone who has decided to be with another person in order to become capable of doing what that person does or to become what that person is. Now, it is not necessarily doing everything that the one being followed does, but it is learning to do everything he does in a manner and motive that he does it. Can I shorten that? In other words, it's learning how to live my life as the one I am following would live my life if I were him. It's learning to live my life as the one I am following would live my life if I were him or he was mine. Can I give you 4 prerequisites to being a follower? These were 4 for Matthew. They actually haven't changed over the centuries. They're still the prerequisites for following Jesus today. 1 is an invitation. Well, Matthew's already gotten that. We've already talked about that. Do you know that each one of us have an invitation to follow Jesus? That's not the same as being born again. That's to follow him. That's to be a student. That's to be an apprentice, a learner, to live with him, to walk with him, to do every day in his presence, so that over the course of time of being with him, our thinking would actually be formed, our heart motive would actually be formed to be consistent with him because we're with him. And we end up doing our life as though he was doing his life through us if he were us. This is what we're invited to do. There's a second prerequisite. You actually would have to desire that. You'd have to have some want for that, a longing for that, maybe even be desperate for it. And Jesus clearly thinks that Matthew would be a great candidate to be a follower. And so when he hears the Pharisees' objection to this is what he says in verse 12. When Jesus heard this, he said, look, guys, healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. That's really deep stuff right there. It's obvious. It's sick people that go to doctors, right? Because they need doctors. Healthy people, or people who think they're healthy, which that would never be us, right? We're really sick, but we think we're healthy. They don't need to go to a doctor, and they don't. But what in all the world does that have to do with apprenticeship or following? What are you saying here, and it appears obvious, Jesus, is that healthy people do not need a doctor, but sick people do. But who, in the conversation, the Pharisees or Matthew, who's the well person and who's the sick person here? Who is it that needs a doctor and who does not need a doctor? On the surface, it seems pretty clear. The Pharisees were the well people who did not need a doctor. In their view and the Jewish community view, they were the paragon of righteousness, the most disciplined, the most dedicated, the most sacrificial, the most connected to God of anybody in their culture. And of course, they don't need a wellness check of any kind. On the other hand, there was nobody sicker than the tax collector Matthew, who could not actually be insured because of a pre-existing treasonous sin condition in his life. We know about pre-existing conditions. Matt had one, and he did not qualify. So Jesus wants to clarify something. And with it comes a similarly shocking response, just like Jesus inviting Matthew to follow him was. This is what Jesus says. Then he adds, now go and learn the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For I have come to call not those who think they're righteous, but those who know they are sinners. In other words, to cut to the chase, Jesus seems to be saying the people that make the worst followers of those who think they're already doing great on the righteousness scale, but actually might be pretty sick and not realize it. On the other hand, the best followers with the greatest potential are those who know that they would likely make bad followers and are convinced that they're not worthy to be invited, but are so desperate for redemption from their away from God life that they see following Jesus as the best possible offer and best they'll ever get. The offer is just too good to pass up, and they're all in on it. It appears the differentiating factor is desire, even desperation. Here's the point, just to clarify. The invitation to follow and the kind of desire and humility it takes to be a follower of Jesus have not changed since Jesus first made the offer. However, often, the governing assumption today among professing Christians is that we can self-identify as Christian forever and never actually follow Jesus. We can even call ourselves followers and not actually follow, not actually be a student, not actually be a learner or an apprentice of his, not actually approach Jesus as the smartest, greatest teacher ever, and just sign up to be a student of his, to be a lifelong learner, to follow where he leads and to follow who he is as the divine Son of God, to actually engage and align our lives in getting to personally know who he is and what life in his kingdom looks like. Do you know that? You can be a Christian and not a follower. You can even think you're following, but have the wrong idea of what following is and not be a follower. What is this with desire? Well, maybe it's a little bit like water. Elfie and I have this constant discussion. Elfie drinks lots of water. She'll drink about 894 ounces of water a day. And I'll get to it. And she lovingly will remind me, Brad, water is essential. You've got to take a water bottle with you. You've got to drink enough water. You have to. And you know something? She's right. She's got it. I agree with her, and I just don't drink much. I substitute water for something I even know is less than water in terms of thirst quenching and health, right? So she's right, and yet I don't do it. She does. Who's a follower of the water regimen? I could consider myself that because I take a sip every once in a while. She's got it. She's following that. That's a difference here, and it has to do with desire. Do you see something? Elfie thinks that drinking sufficient water is non-optional. I think it's optional. Clearly, I think it's optional. Now, that might be okay when it comes to water. It definitely is not okay when it comes to following Jesus. It's not optional. I don't know if you were sold this idea that if you'll just say yes to Jesus, invite him to be in your heart and your life, you got your ticket punched to heaven, and between then and heaven, it's just okay, just do your best. You got sold a bill of goods. We got born again, became a new person, to be a new person, to be a student of Jesus a whole life long. I love what a mentor author of mine says. He says this: I think some people take the following of Jesus so seriously that they'll be in heaven 3 days before they realize they're there. Because life looks so much like heaven already for them. And this is the good life we've been invited into. That's what following is. It's not optional. It's not a second half of. It isn't. Why do we think it's optional? Why do we think I don't really need to follow? I seem to be surviving all right. That's something that we say sometimes. Sure, I feel the pangs of guilt or disappointment every once in a while with my faith, but I just don't know if I'm in on that. Seems like too much of a commitment. And frankly, parts of it's not all that attractive to me. I guess that's why it's optional. It's probably something that people who are really serious about their faith, like pastors and teachers and really serious people, it's probably for people who are Olympic level in their faith, like faith on steroids. And tell you the truth, I'm really just content to pray when I need something, have some certainty about going to heaven when I die, know God is kind of out there watching if I ever need him. Besides, I really don't have the time to invest in this. I'm a really busy person. It's optional. It's optional, but it isn't. The idea of being an option has created a category of followers that's different from first century. Back then, there were really two categories. You were either a follower or a non-follower. Those were the two categories that were there. Follower, you were all in with Jesus. Non-followers were folks that said, I'm not sure yet. I'm not with him yet. I'm not following him. I'm not interested. Or as Matthew was up to this point, I got other things going on. Or I just don't know about it. But what has happened in our time, self-identifying Christians have developed a new category. It's neither followers nor non-followers, it's non-following followers. They call themselves followers, but they're not really following. And it's a category in Jesus' day that it just didn't exist. But it does for us. But that's not Matthew's response. It appears to be non-optional for him because it looks like just too good a deal for him to jump into. So he jumps at the opportunity, sees it as an opportunity of a lifetime. His desire is something more than just casual interest and optional. He is all in on this thing. He does this. Now, I don't know if we can create the desire to become followers or more deeply following or more mature followers, whatever you would call it. I don't know that we can create that desire. But the only way you can create desire for thirst is to not drink. But that's dangerous. Here's my personal experience, if you're interested. You're getting it even if you're not interested, actually. In my late teens or early 20s, my desire centered around a question as I look back on my life, and it was the question of what is true. I'd grown up in a family of faith, a really churched family, religious family, and I got to be on my own when I was 18 years old, and now I needed to figure out faith for myself, not because I was there with it, it just was in my mind constantly. I wanted to know if God was true. I wanted to know if he was real. And so I set about a task like many of you have, just trying to ask the question and read books and talk to people and figure out for myself what's true. What's true about God? What's true about me? What's true about my life, my purpose? What's true was what my desire was. By my mid-20s, I'm a husband and I'm a dad, and I don't know when exactly, but the question changed, the desire changed. I now wanted to know what it meant to be successful, what it meant to be good at something. So I wanted to be a great employee. I wanted to be a great employer. I wanted to be a great husband, a great dad. I wanted to be a great citizen. I just wanted to be successful in these areas. And that's not bad. And that was the desire and the tug in my heart. That's what I longed for, to figure out how do I be great. And so I would excel at something, get an award, get a promotion, and I would go, see, I'm great. I'm getting better at these things. And it just stoked my fire. And it created greater desire for that. And then sometime, like 10 years ago or so, after a 25-year run with that as a question, the question changed for me. And I think I don't know exactly how to articulate it, but I think it's the question of, how do I just become a good person? Just good inside and out. And it would be that question that would drive me back to Jesus. Now, I hadn't drifted from him. I'm a pastor, crying out loud, right? But I knew there was something not fully there just yet. And if it's not too bold, I think I became a follower of Jesus only about 10 years ago. Now, I was interested, but the question changed for me. How do I become a really good person? And I decided that I would hang out with Jesus. I would get to know him. We get to figure out a little more of who he is and how he thinks. And I started reading different things and talked to different people and went to a conference or two that was focused on this. And lo and behold, over the course of some years actually, my identity changed. And I discovered this great offer to be a student of Jesus, to stop performing for him, to stop trying to get him to like me, to stop being a good guy, but to be internally a good person. I think I moved from being a non-following follower to being a follower. See, I've been a Christian. A new life had been infused in me when I was probably about 13 years old. Didn't recognize it fully. But something changed for me in these last years. And it had to do with change of desires that came on the heels of choosing something more from my King. So I want to give you two more prerequisites. I'll do these quickly. So if the first one is an invitation and the second one is desire, the third one is proximity. You actually have to be with the one that you're choosing to follow. In the first century, if you said yes to Jesus as Matthew does, he literally physically followed. Now, the scary thing for us when we read that is, got to sell my house, my car, leave my family, go be a missionary to some distant land someplace. That doesn't mean that. I mean, it might be the case for some of us, but that's not what it's after. You see, we can't follow Jesus physically like the first century followers did who had him physically right there, and they would travel in the dust of that rabbi. We can't do that in that way. But here's the thing. The desire, intentions, and priorities that they have, the heart, the mind, the humility, the inner attitude is forever the same, regardless of what century you're in. That's the same. And that we can have. And that we can pursue. And that's the proximity that Jesus offers to us. We can actually intentionally foster environments where we become more and more aware of his actual presence We can do that. Jesus is the most amazing and interesting human being and incarnation of God ever. What priority would you give to be able to spend time with someone who is the most intelligent being ever, knows how to change the molecular structure of water into wine? Now, we think he just, poof, did it. But what if he's so smart, he knows the molecular structure of water, how to manipulate it and turn it into wine? That's pretty smart. What would you think about spending time with someone who had figured out how to regenerate diseased human limbs without a transplant, and by activating dead and dying cells and bringing them back to life and actually growing limbs? Interested in hanging out with a guy like that? Pretty interesting. What do you think about hanging out with someone who can read the atmospheric conditions associated with violent storms and can rearrange them to stop the storm just by talking to it? I find that person quite interesting, actually. What do you think about hanging out with someone who invented this planet, but did it out of nothing? Didn't take a few objects that were already there and reformat them and build something out of it. Out of nothingness. What's nothingness? He knows. I just find it really interesting that he would know, and I could spend time with someone like that. What would you give to hang out with someone who's a world-class artist, who personally paints sunrises and sunsets in places that nobody ever sees except himself because he just likes to do it? How would you feel about hanging out with someone who is the object of more pieces of art than any human being, who is a poet and a songwriter and the author of the best-selling book ever? Do you think he knows a thing or two? How would you feel about someone who, get this, created 500,000 different species of beetles? Like, wouldn't a couple of hundred have been enough? He just can't stop himself. He just creates endlessly. I wonder how many more beetles are in the queue. But wouldn't you just like to hang out with someone like that and find out and discover what he knows? Wouldn't you like to hang out with someone who has all the wisdom of the ages in his mind, as well as holds the entire universe together moment by moment by moment? Wouldn't you want to hang out with someone who knows you personally, calls you by your first name, loves you enough to throw himself in a live grenade and save your life? That would be an interesting story. Wouldn't you want to be with someone who's promised to never ever leave you or forsake you, even if you want to? This is who we're hanging out with. This is who invites us to come be with him, to enjoy him, delight in him, and be near him, to never walk away from us. Who doesn't want that? That's what followers do. They get to know the God they don't yet know as well as he could be known, and they'll never get to know him completely, but they walk down a path as his students. It's truly amazing. One last prerequisite, and then I'm going to pray. So here they are: invitation, desire, proximity, and intent. It's a prerequisite. Our King who invites us to follow us does not make us do that. He invites us to do that and says, what do you choose? Would you be interested in that? So if you wanted someone to be your rabbi in the first century and that rabbi offered you a spot with him, what would you do? You'd have to intend to do it. You'd actually have to go do it. And then you would find out from him and from others who follow him what steps are next. This is kind of logical, but you would ask, well, what do I need to read? Who do I need to hang out with? What do I need to listen to? What do I need to watch? Is there somebody who's already following further than I am that could, if I spent time with them, could advance where I'm at? Is there a group of followers I could join in with? How could I arrange my daily schedule and calendar to spend time with my rabbi or teacher to talk, listen, and learn from him? We know how to do this. It's a question of intent. Do I really intend to be a follower of the greatest being who lives today and has ever lived? It's an offer you can't refuse. Now, Jesus, to this end, thank you for inviting us into being followers of yours. For some of us, it's almost too good to take in and to be any more than kind of an ethereal, wish to, want to kind of idea. But this is legit, isn't it? Jesus, it's cool to look back at those who have undertaken this idea of being your student, lifelong learners, apprentices of yours, and to watch what's happened in their lives. I can't think of anyone there. I guess there could be someone, but I can't think of anybody who's ever said yes to this, who look back and go, that was a bad call. No, instead, so many say, why didn't I decide sooner? Why didn't I intend to do this? So Jesus, in our group today, may there be those who would say, yep, I intend, and then take the steps to do that for your sake, Christ, and theirs. Amen.